everyone.
Hello everyone.
Welcome back to our book club. I am Miss Maka.
And I am Mr. Darrell. Today we are going to talk about an American classic, Rip Van Winkle, The Legend of This Man.
By Washington Irving.
Now Maka, this term has become an idiom in English. The term Rip Van Winkle refers to someone who's out of touch, who's stuck in the past. I have a question for you. Do you consider yourself someone who is a Rip Van Winkle?
Oh, no, Mr. Darrell, of course not, because I really love being in touch with modern life and current affairs.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, let's get to the agenda.
Yes, of course, traditionally, we will start with the vocabulary that we need during the program. Then we will say a few things about the author. After, we will talk about the summary of the book. So we will tell you in short what is the story about.
From there, we will focus in on characters a little bit. So that means going in and seeing how the story is told through the use of characters. From there, we have the setting. And the setting, we try to answer the questions of the when and the where of the story to give you a better idea of where it comes from. And then we have a look at the main themes. Now, every author has main themes he's trying to convey to the reader, and this tries to answer the question of why. Why did he choose different parts of the story to tell? And we will try to look at that.
Of course. And finally, we will conclude our session and give you a homework. Okay, now let's start with the vocabulary.
Okay, very good. So we have chosen 8 words to focus in on, which we will bring up in our discussion and that you can find in the book itself. So the first word is, it's a phrasal word, to go hunting. To go hunting. And the meaning is when you go looking for wild animals for the purpose of catching them or killing them.
Yes, and in Georgian, it is Sanadirod Tasula.
Our next word is another phrasal verb. It is to fall asleep. To fall asleep. To fall asleep. And this is just another way of saying to go to sleep.
Chadzineba.
Our next word is trouble. Trouble. It's a situation or something that is difficult or can be annoying for someone.
Sirtule, რაღაც უსიამოვნება.
Our next word is rusty, and this is an adjective, rusty. This is when a metal, such as iron, for example, turns reddish brown when it turns color because of water or air affecting it.
Yes, Zhangiani.
Our next word, which is connected to the plot of the story, is election. Election. This is the selection of a person for public office by voting for them.
Archevnebi.
And we should describe that word, vote, as well. Our next word, to vote, our verb. It's a formal expression or of opinion or choice, either positive or negative, made by an individual.
ხმის მიცემა.
Our next word is puzzled. 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 It's an adjective, and it is when you are confused by something.
დაბნეული, შეცბუნებული.
And our last word, fear. Fear. A distressing emotion caused by danger, the feeling or condition of being afraid.
Yes, shishi. Thank you, Mr. Darrell. It was really interesting. So now, before we go into details of the book and the author, we have questions for our audience. So the first one is, what's the difference between fall asleep and go to sleep?
Actually, there is a slight difference. Falling asleep is when you go to sleep right away.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, I think we should move on to a look at the author now. Washington Irving, an American living in the 18th century, so quite early. He was born into a family of limited resources, living in New York City. At a certain point, he travels over to Europe and he picks up a lot of observations and information from what's happening in Europe. And he returns to New York in about like 1806, the 19th century already. He practices law, Washington Irving, and he collaborates with his brother William occasionally to publish stories, satirical stories, political stories, that kind of thing. So that's his focus.
By 1809, Irving had created his fictional amateur historian and narrator, Diedrich Knickerbocker. He was an eccentric American of Dutch descent. His narrative mixed with fact and fantasy to lampoon the political figures and the early Dutch settlers.
He published a series of short stories sometime after that, some of which were some of the famous American short stories that we know from him. Rip Van Winkle is one of them. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a kind of spooky horror story, is another one. And there were a few more in this collection, and he called it the sketchbook. It earned him an enthusiastic fan base, and he was popular in the United States and Europe as well. At the same time, he also started to write history rather than fiction.
After serving as a member of the American diplomatic service in Spain and in England, Irving returned in his native country in 1832. So many things had changed there. Irving was very observant of the changes and in the society and in the politics, as Rip Van Winkle shows. So he actually didn't really like those changes.
That leads to a good question for our audience, and I wonder who can answer this one. Do you think that Washington Irving, our writer, was a conservative figure or a progressive figure?
Well, I think he was more conservative because he clearly preferred the old ways before the American Revolution to the new ways.
A very good answer. I think you can't deny that there is a conservative element to this story.
Of course. So now let's go to our summary. So what is the story about? Irving admitted that his inspiration was a German fairy tale called Karl Katz. The title Rip Van Winkle refers to the name of the main character, a pleasant, if rather lazy, man. In the years since the story's publication, Rip Van Winkle has come to signify as individual oblivious of his surroundings.
Yeah, and there's a lot of immigrational background to the story as well. So he represents the Dutch American community that was in New York at the time. And this story is really about the Dutch community and their concerns and the ways of being. Rip is an easygoing man. He spends all of his time in the village inn, drinking beer with his friends. He goes hunting, he loves hunting. And he does this to escape his bad-tempered wife. And she's presented as such, a very bad-tempered woman who pushes him out of the family.
Oh, like when he goes hunting, he encounters the ghost, Henry Hudson, before he falls asleep. 20 years later, Rip wakes up and he realizes that American Revolution has already ended and been won. And the only person who can recognize him is his old friend, this is Peter Wenderdok. And with his wife dead, Rip moves in his daughter's house and continues to spend time in the inn.
Yeah, there have been numerous shocking changes, of course, in this process. When he wakes up, his gun is rusty, his beard is quite long, his hunting dog is missing. He returns to the village where he recognizes no one. So they've all grown old, possibly died, possibly moved away, possibly been affected by the American Revolution itself. He arrives just in time for an election, and he finds out that there's no more king, the British king, King George III. People are actually voting for something new called a president, and this is also new for him.
Yes. Also, what he notices is that one of the sign on the inn that was King George's portrait has been replaced with one of the George Washington's portrait. Van Winkle learns that most of his friends were killed in American Revolution. He is also disturbed to find another man called Rip Van Winkle, who actually is his own son. And he also realizes that many things have been changed. His grown daughter takes him in and he resumes his usual idleness. His strange tale is solemnly taken to heart by the Dutch settlers. So we have another question to our audience. Did 20 years of sleeping change Rip's character? What do you think?
Well, I think it didn't. He was even happy to stay as he was before falling in a deep sleep.
Yes, thank you very much. I do agree with you. And generally, I think that it is really hard to change anyone's character once they already are grown up, right?
That seems to be what this story is saying. But on that note, let's move on to the characters of the story. We have selected quite a few. Let's start with Rip Van Winkle, the protagonist of our story, the so-called hero of the story. He's a kind, gentle, generous man, eager to help his neighbors, but there's one big problem with him. He hates work. He hates to work. His wife is always complaining about the fact that he's lazy to be productive, lazy to go out there and work his farm and work the house as well. Instead, he loves to fish and hunt with his favorite dog, Wolf. To escape his wife, in fact, on that fateful day, he climbs up into the mountains to find some peace and quiet. And it's there that he meets up with this stranger, which he later finds out is a ghost. And because of some strange magical event that happens, he sleeps for 20 years. When he returns back to the town, he's confused by all the changes he sees. And this is a kind of like, it's a metaphor for a man who's lazy, fundamentally lazy, goes off, gets lost in the world, and then comes back and finds that the world has changed without him. Setting aside like the magic aspect of it, you can see that this is a man who, if you're not productive, you lose your place in the world and you come back and you're confused by everything.
Yes, so I would agree that being inactive is like being asleep for 20 years maybe,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have mentioned many times his wife, but I think we didn't mention her name. So this is Dame Van Winkle. So she was the mother of Rip's son and a daughter. So she's a harsh, loud, and intolerant woman, and she always speaks her mind whenever she doesn't like something, if people do something she doesn't really like. Although she's a figure of fun and scorn in the story, it might be said that maybe this is actually Rip's fault that she has become such a complainer. In the story, her nagging is what sends Rip for hunting and actually on his fateful climb up the mountain.
Very good. Let's move on to the next character, the stranger. Now, there's a lot of mystery around the stranger. Initially, Rip thinks he's a real man. He goes up the mountain, he sees him while he's hunting. And something wrong with the stranger is that he's wearing clothes that are very, very old. So he doesn't appear to be modern at all. And in fact, he's with a group of men that are playing bowling way off in the distance. And later it seems that the stranger might have been a ghost. Now, the town folk in the story claim that the stranger and his crew of friends return to those mountains every 20 years to keep an eye on the river that they discovered years ago. And so it's kind of like it's connected to the colonial past of America. So Rip is at the moment when America changes into a democracy and a republic, and yet we have the stranger and his ghosts representing the old colonial past of America. So it's all kind of coming together in this one moment.
Yeah, okay. So our next character is Peter van der Donk. So he is the only person actually who could recognize Rip after he came back. So he is a descendant of a historian of the same name. His ancestor had written an early account of the early history of this region. So which Wonderdog confirms that the ghosts actually come back in every 20 years, and what they do, they revisit the river they had discovered.
Okay, that was Peter van Donk. So let's move on to the last character, Judith Gardner. A small character, but important in her own way. She is Rip Van Winkle's daughter, and she's now fully grown. When he comes back from the mountains after 20 years, initially he's struck by her appearance. So he knows there's something familiar about her, but he doesn't know what. And then eventually he finds out that she's his daughter. But funnily enough, he goes straight back to being his old self with her. Nothing has changed.
Wow. Okay. Mr. Darrell, do you have a question for our audience?
Yes.
It's really interesting.
I do have a question. Now you've heard us speak about some of the characters. Let's go back to Rip Van Winkle himself. How would you describe his character?
I think he was a good man because, as you said before, he was kind and generous, but also he was crazy and he hated to work hard, and that's why this caused lots of problems in his family.
Excellent. Yeah, that was basically Rip's character.
Yes. Okay. So we could say that he was a kind man, only a bit lazy.
He was a good man.
He was a good man, of course. But I have another question. Do you think this story is a political story or a fantasy story?
Well, I think it was political because it showed how society changed the American Revolution. But of course, it was also a fantasy story because it is impossible for a person to suffer 20 years without any medical support.
Yeah, I do agree. So
That might be the genius of the story. Like, it's a political story and a fantasy at the same time, which he has combined to make this new kind of story.
yeah. So, but still unbelievable, of course. Thank you very much. So now let's talk about when and where this story happened. Let's talk about the setting of the story. So, New York and the surrounding countryside experienced economic growth. By the time the American Revolution, I will remind you the years, 1775, 1783 happened, citizens of the new republic embraced their civic duty, such as voting. So they also profited from economical growth and some agricultural developments that happened after the revolution. So most Americans were enthusiastic about the booming economy. Yet there remained some people who actually had some kind of nostalgia of the earlier time. So simpler way of life, that's what they considered it to be. This story and this earlier period and the transformation to a modern life is actually depicted in the story Rip Van Winkle.
Very good point. There's a lot of nostalgia in the stories. I'll move now to the where. The stories in this book evoke early settler life in New York's Hudson River Valley, and he does so with a lot of skill. There's a lot of color, energy, and humor in Washington Irving's early descriptions of the settler life. Irving is revealed in this way to be a master of landscape description. One of the reasons why his book is so attractive. And he's also got a skill for lively character depiction. So he's really good with characters. He uses his wit to criticize society, the way people think, the way people behave as well. And you can see that there's a skill of satire within him. And in fact, if you remember, he had been writing satire earlier, political satire, and now he's just turning that satirical skill into literary satire. Now, the American setting that allows him to contrast idyllic colonial life with post-revolution life is really what makes the story interesting for us and for Americans to this day as well. The life before a big revolution and then the life that happens after a big revolution. And when you live through it, you don't notice these changes, but when you are taken out of it, like Rip, suddenly you see clearly how life was before and how life was after. So this is a great literary kind of technique of showing change really sharply. I have another question for any of you to answer. What is the main difference in the village now, before the American Revolution and then after?
Well, I think it changed from an idyllic, slow-paced village to a busy, energetic world.
Very good answer. Very good answer indeed. Let's move on to the main themes now. We have selected a few, and we are going to speak about them. And these, I think, are the main themes that we have seen in this book and deserve some discussion. We have freedom versus tyranny. That's our first main theme. And it's all over the book, if you look from the beginning to the end. Washington Irving, the author, shows the theme of freedom versus tyranny in the way that Rip Van Winkle wants freedom. He wants freedom to live a simple life. He wants freedom away from his wife as well. He wants domestic freedom. He wants political freedom in a way. He wants freedom away from society. And Rip is tormented to despair almost by his wife's constant nagging.
Yes. And in Irving's work, we can see that he suggests that responsibility is a tyranny itself, as is being forced to do what you don't really want to do. But in the case of his wife, who actually had all rights to ask him to work for the kids, to support the family, and the children are described as ragged and poor because of his laziness. But in some ways, the responsibilities of citizenship, such as supporting a political party or a candidate and voting in elections, are some kind of a type of a tyranny for Rip. Because they constrain his freedom to live a simple life unburdened by politics.
What it comes down to, it seems, is that Rip just wants to be free to be lazy, which doesn't really make him the most sympathetic character. You'll have to agree, Ms. Maka.
Yeah.
However, I suppose Washington Irving presented him in this way for his larger purpose of showing the difference between the pre-revolution and the post-revolution.
Exactly. And now actually it is a good time to continue with our second main theme, that is progress. It is a story about the birth of a new American nation and how it actually changed the nation and the lifestyle. Regardless of the vast changes that occur around him, Rip actually stays whatever he was before falling asleep. So both in the early period of the story and when he returns to his village after 20 years, we see the same person, same gentle, idle soul.
The village, though, itself changes dramatically. So while Rip stays the same, the village goes from being a quiet, idyllic place to a much more bustling, busy, productive, even progressive place. There was an inn before the revolution, before he falls asleep. There was a small little inn, which is like a hotel or a motel. It turns into a huge, bustling hotel with people coming and going. And that is a good symbol, I think, of what's happened. Life in America has changed from being maybe partly colonial to being this new future empire. And that's basically what the story is focused on. The village itself, the people in the village have changed, their characters have changed. They were sleepy before, they were content to be working the farm. And after the revolution, when Rip comes back, It's a politics-obsessed town. So everyone's become more politicized and more active and more observant of things that are going on around them.
So, not only politics has changed, but also people are altering the nature. For example, the big tree that shaded the quiet inn had been cut down, and it was replaced by some kind of bare flagpole. RIP is the embodiment of the early colonial tradition and its simple way of life. So Irving's reader can easily guess the message from the writer. So he was trying to contrast between earlier values and the increasing focus on money, on work, or on work for money. Okay, and profit that was to become the hallmark of the new American nation.
Okay, very good. I think it's time for another question of our audience. And based on this, what does it mean to all of you to be a progressive person?
Well, in my opinion, people who are progressive favor reform and civil liberties.
That's a great answer. That is exactly what a progressive person is known for doing and known for being, Ms. Maka.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think it's time now that we wrapped up our lesson of the day.
Yeah, let's do it. So, the first one that we talked about was the author himself. So this is Washington Irving.
And then we spoke about the summary. This is a story about a man who goes off into the mountains, falls asleep for 20 years, comes back and finds the world a changed place.
Definitely. So then we talked about the characters. So we included 5 main characters, but I would still say Rip Van Winkle, of course, the main character, lazy, but a very gentle and kind man.
And then we had a look at the setting, which the when of the story is the 18th century, the 1790s, before and after the American Revolution. And the where of the story is New York, the Hudson River area and the Catskill Mountains area.
Yes, and of course our final part is main themes. That was, we had freedom versus tyranny, where writer tried to draw the line between these two. And the second one was progress. So how did America change after the American Revolution?
Thank you to our studio audience for the great answers they had today. Well, I've got a question for our TV audience now. Here's our question for today. Imagine that you fall asleep tomorrow and you wake up after 20 years in Georgia. What do you think might have changed?
Oh, that's a very interesting homework. Now I'm going to translate it into Georgian. შემდეგი შეკითხვა არის თქვენი საშინაო დავალება. წარმოიდგინე, დაიძინე და 20 წლის შემდეგ რეალობაში გაიღვიძე. როგორ ფიქრობ, რა შეიცვლებოდა? So you can send your homework to the indicated address on the screen.
Great question. And we would like the answers to be sent to the address you see on the screen.
Okay, I guess that's all for today. It was really interesting day, I guess. So thank you very much, and thank you, the audience.
Have a great week.
Thank you. Goodbye.